Welcome back to Fresh Economic Thinking. Cameron Murray here, and today I have a special guest, Ben Phillips from ANU, to talk about housing, all the things we get right and wrong, what the data really says. I always recommend Ben's stuff online. You should follow him on Twitter if you just want the data on housing in Australia. So thanks for coming, Ben.
My pleasure, Cam. It's great to be here. Always enjoy your work on Twitter and other avenues that you work in. It's always been interesting watching your thoughts and insights on housing and other areas, of course.
Oh, thank you. So I guess why don't we start by introducing you to the listeners. You're an academic. You do research on welfare systems and lots of different things. How did you get involved in housing, and what's your sort of main interest, and how does it relate to getting into housing?
Well, look, going way back, I really started out, I guess, with an interest in numbers and maths. Probably not surprising if you follow my tweets. It's pretty data heavy. I wanted to apply that to something that was interesting, and I thought, look, I like current affairs. Economics seems interesting, and at the time, we're back in the 1990s. I'm that old, unfortunately. Economics was pretty sexy at the time. We had a big recession, a serious recession, not sort of a pretend recession. We had a treasurer called Paul Keating, or a prime minister called Paul Keating, who was pretty interesting. Whether you agreed with him or not, it was always interesting. So that got me into economics, and then look, from there I worked in various places. I worked at the ABS, the Bureau of Stats, worked at a place called Tourism Forecasting, where I did lots of sort of number crunching and forecasting. And then I worked at Housing Industry Association. And that's kind of where I got into housing policy. So I was working as one of their senior economists there and doing housing forecasting, and also looking at generally the housing market. And I've also worked at a place called NatSem in the past, which was back in the day was one of Australia's sort of most respected economic organisations. And I did a great variety of work there, but housing was part of that. So looking at things like housing stress and trying to understand the housing market, and more broadly looking at sort of welfare and tax in Australia. But look, housing's always been an area of considerable interest to me. It's just in terms of hot topics, housing has always been of interest. I can't remember a time where we didn't say there wasn't a housing affordability crisis, Cam. What we're talking about now is no different really to what we were talking about in the early 2000s when house prices were booming back then.
Yep.
There's always been a housing shortage, according to the media. Not
Yep.
too much has really changed. So, but it's always been interesting. I've just found it, really interesting to be engaged in that. And there's lots of different views on it. And I'm not sure anyone's really quite sure what the problems. Well, we know what the problems are, but how to solve them. I'm not sure anyone's really nailed them.
Yeah, well, let me take you back then to the 90s. Um, a couple of questions. What's the same in the housing conversation? What's different, let's say, in the last 30 years? And at a broader point, maybe you could, after that, you could zoom out. And does Australia have good houses? Do we have enough houses? Like, if you travel abroad, most people who come to Australia are like, wow, you're all rich. Look at the size of your houses. Look at your cities. Do we have a problem, or is it just part of this ongoing storytelling exercise where we have, winners and losers in an economy, and at different times we hear the views of different groups to different amounts? What are your thoughts?
Look, I think generally speaking, Australia is an incredibly lucky country. I mean, if you go to most other countries, their problems are much bigger, much more substantial than what we have in Australia. But I guess everything's relative. If you're used to things being pretty good, you'll manage to find problems where perhaps other countries wouldn't think they're really genuine problems. So perhaps we're in a bit of that situation. Having said that, there are people, who, of course, in Australia who are very poor. We have an Indigenous population in remote areas where there's considerable issues, and it looks like a third world country. So there are problems, but for most of us, our problems, I think, are a bit more imagined than they are real. But look, going back to your first
Yeah.
question, I guess I've been looking at housing policy pretty closely now for probably a bit over 20 years, and the stories haven't really changed that much. I still read the same stories in the Financial Review and various papers. I don't want to just dob on the Financial Review, but usually the industry's been talking for a long time about we don't build enough houses. It's usually a very Sydney or perhaps Melbourne-centric story. We don't talk a lot about the regions, even though things like housing stress and financial stress are usually bigger in the regions than they are in some of the capital cities. But we've been talking about, it has changed a little bit. I think back in the 2000s, we talked a lot about things like infrastructure charging. which I
Yeah.
don't think we hear so much about these days. When I was at the Housing Industry Association, that was one of their hot topics, which they've been talking about for probably more than a decade at least. But the main story generally has been the industry says we don't build enough houses. Um, Certain commentators, say Peter Tulip, for example, who we know and love on Twitter, talks a lot about we don't build enough houses, we don't build them in the right location. I have some
Yeah.
sympathy for some of that, not all of it. But look, it's been a similar story that the whole time that's been the main story. But then others will say it's more of a demand problem. So people will say there's too many migrants, or they'll say that look, it's been driven by interest rates, or they'll say it's been driven by negative gearing, investors being greedy, capital gains. There's lots of different stories, but unfortunately, a lot of the time, Cam, I think we tend
Yeah.
to think that it's one problem. The reason why house prices are so high is because it's one problem. It's capital gains tax, or it's a lack of supply.
Yeah.
And we forget that there's other countries that look, they're in pretty much the same boat. So the UK and many similar countries like say Canada and some parts of the United States, house prices are higher. They went up at a similar time. It's probably there's a common theme to a lot of this that we kind of
Yeah.
miss, that we're not the lone ranger with high house prices.
Yeah, yeah. I often tell people that because I often get the opposite story. Like someone will say, "Oh, we're not taxing capital gains enough," and others will say, "Well, of course you're taxing property owners with capital gains, so you got to get rid of the capital gains tax." And we don't really have our story straight. There's a lot of self-interest creeping in, I think, subconsciously in the debate. But one thing you just mentioned then is housing stress, people in the regions and the indigenous communities, in remote areas being more financially distressed and housing stress. That seems like the opposite of what we hear, right? We hear it's the premium suburbs of Sydney where everyone's housing stressed. Is there anything like, is the debate just completely divorced from the data? Is there anything else in the debate we get wrong? I'm thinking you often put out charts of financial stress of retiree households versus families and stuff. Like, have you noticed us getting the data or the big picture backwards? And am I
I think
right
there's
that's true, that regions have more housing stress than cities, retirees have less financial stress than workers? Is that true?
Yeah, I think there's often a big disconnect between what we read in the media and what the real story is, and that should be no surprise to anybody. When you look at, I mean, there's various metrics of housing stress. Probably my favourite is, say, the Hilda data or ABS surveys have got this really good data called financial stress. So it asks you questions like, can you afford to heat your home? Can you afford to repay your mortgage for the financial reasons that are holding you back? I think that's quite a useful way of thinking about how financial hardship, and you tend to find it's actually improved over the last, say, 20 years. So Hilda's shows a long-term decline in financial stress, but we never read about that. We always talk about everything's a crisis and things are worse than they've ever been, but
Mm,
I don't really see that in the data. Like I hear the stories, but they're more like they're sort of bedtime stories we're being told rather than the reality of the hard data. And certainly you tend to find that those in the most financial stress are, not surprisingly, low income, working age families, particularly those who live in outer suburbs of Australia or regional parts of Australia. Those living in, say, inner city areas of, say, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, they might be paying quite a lot of money for housing. They might have a very expensive house, or they might be paying a lot of rent, but they've also usually got pretty high incomes.
mm,
Or they might be older Australians, so they might not own the house outright, and they might be an age pensioner, but their costs are relatively low. We
yeah.
don't tend to get these stories told very often, but I think the financial stress story tells an interesting story, and that is that things have probably improved. They haven't necessarily gotten worse. Now, of course, over the last year, there'll be some renters who their rents have gone up quite sharply and things have gotten a little worse. But we also tend to focus a lot on just the short term, what's happening right now,
Yeah.
without any reflection on where have we come from and what's the longer term picture here.
Yeah, I think that's right. I get that in Brisbane a lot. People go, "Oh, my rent's gone up $200 a week." I'm like, "Yeah, but it didn't go up for 12 years. And in fact, it might have gone down nominally, right? And we had inflation, we had rising incomes over 12 years. So we do forget those periods. I definitely think there's some kind of selective memory with housing. We remember the booms and forget the bust. And people always tell me, "Oh, housing is going to make 7% a year, this and that." I'm like, "Oh, did you forget the 2017 to 2022 period in Sydney where prices went down nominally?" Like it's like they disappear from our memory and we're back to crisis mode again. So that's a good point. Do you think we expect too much from the housing market? Do you feel like we just expect it to solve every possible problem that could exist? I feel like
I think a
that's
lot of
where the
this is probably
conversation ends
media
up.
driven. I
Pardon
think a
me?
lot of it's kind of media driven, Cam. Like I'm not
Ah,
sure the average person on the street is as diabolically concerned about this as what the media makes out. I mean, not surprisingly, the media, they need to get clicks, and if you're going to tell a story, you want to tell an interesting story. If you based all of your analysis or your stories on some of the ABS CPI data, it might be quite boring. So you tend to pick out anecdotes that are interesting, or you pick out the data that happens to be most interesting, and that might be it might be the rental vacancies data at the moment is look pretty concerning, so you focus on
Mm,
that. And if that sort of dies down and then the CPI numbers come up, you focus on that. So you're always looking for the interesting story. You're never looking for what really is the true representation. Not to deny that there are people who are struggling. Of course, there are people who are struggling. There kind of always has been though, and I dare
mm.
say that probably things were more difficult. For my father's generation back, say in the 50s and 60s, even though we kind of think of it as a sort of a
Golden age.
golden period.
Yeah. So just on that, picking the extremes of the rental market and the low vacancy right now, you've done some partial analysis of some of the ABS surveys, and you reckon actually rent to income ratios have fallen in the last couple of years. Is that right? Can you
Yeah. So
walk me
look,
through that? I remember
again,
seeing a chart.
yeah, look, there's various ways of measuring it, but I mean, an interesting part was, say, the census in 2021. So quite rightly, we were concerned. I think in the census of about 2011, rents had increased. There was pretty strong population growth. We weren't building a lot. And I think rents can reflect, if there's a bit of a lack
Hmm.
of building that can come through in higher rents. And we had a lot of stories back then about the rental stress and rental crisis. And that was probably to some extent fair enough. But then the next 10 years, we built a lot of housing. I think you'd be hard pressed to find too many countries that built on a per capita basis anything like what we built. And
Yeah.
rents basically they went sideways. Their nominal terms didn't really change at all for about 10 years. And really up to about 2021, 2022, we had incomes were not doing anything special, but they were still growing in nominal terms and rents pretty much weren't. So things did improve. That sort of rent to income ratio did improve for a lot of people, not everybody, but it's statistics. You kind of got to look at some averages or some summary data at some point. You can't focus on
Yeah.
every individual. Things did improve. And we don't seem to ever be able to acknowledge that something's improved. You don't read many stories about, hey, things aren't too bad at the moment. That's not very interesting. You just want to hear the stories about how things are terrible. And look, the last 12 months, rents have increased strongly, whether it's advertised rents or actual rents, and things have gotten a little bit worse. But as you point out, that's coming off 10 years of a very, very good, yes, very solid improvement in terms of rental affordability.
Yeah. Well, I think the last survey of income and housing, which actually asked renter households their income and their housing costs, was in 2019 and 2020. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's the
So since
2019
then, how have
2019
you?
2020 survey. So it does ask. It sort of surveys about it's about 15,000 households, I think, and every quarter it surveys about a quarter of those households. And
Mm,
yeah, you generally tend to find that at least at that point, the rental market was relatively affordable compared to where it's been in the past. But that story never seems to really come out. Unfortunately, ABS hasn't updated that survey for a while. We do know, I think, from say the ABS CPI data that does look at all rentals, that things have gotten probably a little worse since then. But also we had a couple of good years through COVID where there was no increases in rent. So it's kind of the market looks to me like it probably hasn't gotten that much worse since the last survey. So
yeah. Wow.
having said that, there'll be some who, yes, things will have gotten worse. There's some
Yeah.
landlords who are being a little bit greedy and some of their increases are a bit egregious, but that's not everybody. And you will find that that's often the case, that there will be some individuals where things are pretty bad, but there's a lot who aren't going so badly. And we don't hear those stories.
What about the income side of this ledger on housing? I think we, as you say, the media looks at the extremes and not the average, and we can go, oh, rents went up 20% in the last couple of years. Have incomes gone up 20% household incomes? Because we've had inflation, nominal incomes have been rising, people have been working more hours. Do you have your best guess of how much household incomes have risen in the last couple of years?
Look, I think, say the last survey, which is the ABS survey 2019-20, probably the next 2 years after that, you had a situation where incomes did grow pretty strongly. So we had a lot of that was basically free money through the COVID through the COVID period. So there's Job Seeker and JobKeeper, and there was lots of government grants for building more houses, and there's a lot of easy money out there. So the economy was, I think, artificially was traveling very well. So incomes definitely increased more strongly than rents, which went nowhere. And since then, I think it's probably reversed a bit. But
Yeah, okay.
I guess kind of what goes up kind of comes down as well when it's artificially inflated through significant stimulus. You can't really expect that that's going to continue forever. Underlying economic growth is really probably about productivity growth, and we haven't really had that. So you can't really expect to get something for nothing over the long term. There's no such thing as a free lunch. Sometimes I disagree with that, but generally speaking,
Yeah.
I think that kind of works out in economics, and we're seeing a bit of a readjustment. But since 2019-20, I think in terms of rent to income, we're probably in a slightly better position than what we were before COVID, which I think would surprise many. Not sure people would believe me, but that's what the hard data shows us.
People don't believe you. They really don't. But then in their personal, if you make them reflect on their personal situation, go, oh, but 10 years ago, weren't you in this situation? And you're like, yeah, but surely it's getting worse. I keep hearing that, right? That's what, there's a lot of internalizing the media, as you say. So one thing I think is people don't really have a good idea of what the crisis in housing is. Like we just absorb this terminology. And for me, I think it's a lot of this incomes are adjusting, the economy's changing, and some people get left behind in that process, right? So all the rich people move to their suburbs and they're on a pretty stable income, and they're like, well, now where do I go, right? I'm getting left behind in this tournament economy. So I guess to what degree do you think that the valid concerns about housing are distributional rather than about the quantity of homes we have? Because I feel like we concentrate on the quantity. We've got the wrong number of homes and not the distribution of, oh, we allocate homes by price and some people get left behind. If
Yeah,
you had
look,
give us a percentage split maybe of quantity versus distribution, do you
yeah,
think? Like, because for me, it's
look,
like 90+%
yeah, look, I think it's
distribution.
probably something like that myself as well. I think,
Okay.
look, you've got 2 out of 3 people or households are owned. They either own the house outright or they're purchasing it through a mortgage. And most of those with a mortgage, they may have got their mortgage 4 or 5 or 10 or
Mm,
20 years ago, and they're in a very good financial position. So there's a small proportion who may have overloaded on debt in the last couple of years, and um, perhaps they're struggling somewhat. That's true, and
mhm,
there'll be then you've got about 1/3 who rent. Now, many of those are they're still paying the rent that was agreed to pre-COVID, or they're on it's just going up with inflation, and it's not too bad a situation. Not saying they're living the life of a king, but
mm,
it's not that different to where it was. So I wouldn't call it a crisis for the moment. I think where there probably is issues is that, say, if you're, say, new to the market, you've just left home and you're looking to rent, the asking rents have certainly gone up, and you'd be paying a bit of a premium going into the market now. But that's probably, I mean, in terms of the number of houses that become new rentals each year, it's a relatively small share of the rental market. It might be,
mm.
only 1 in 5 rentals each year are a new rental. So I think, again, you're looking at it's less than 10%, maybe as little as 5% who are seriously in some sort of financial trouble at the moment in terms of their housing situation. I think that's what we tend to focus on, as opposed to thinking about the other 90 or 95% who are pretty much in the same situation they were in 5 years ago. Really, not much has changed. But again,
Mm.
if you're in the media, really, you've got a whole bunch of stories in front of you. You pick out the interesting one, and they're the interesting one. It's not that 90% or so who are doing the same thing they were doing 5 years ago, or even in a better position. That's not interesting, I suppose.
And do you get calls from journalists, tell them this, and then they're like, that's not good. I want to call the next guy until I get a better story? Does that ever happen to
Uh,
you?
Look, I think it does happen sometimes, but I think most journos are. Look, there's lots of good journos. I don't want to go too hard on the media. There's plenty of really good journalists, and I think most of them, they know what my position is on these things. So if you're going to write an interesting story, or what you think is an interesting story about a housing crisis, you're probably not going to come to me. You're not going to get an interesting story from me. So you'll go and talk to someone else who will. So there are
Yeah.
many good journalists, but some of them really, they're just writing stories that are going to get a lot of clicks. And to do that, you'll go and talk to the person who's going to give you the story that you want. And that might be going to lobbyists or certain
Yeah.
people who are going to tell you the story that you want to hear. It's a bit of a game.
Yeah. Good point. So here's a question. Back in 2020, during COVID, I predicted that in 2021 the census would show a rise in home ownership rates, simply because between 2017 and 2021, the proportion of mortgages to owner occupiers had bumped up quite a lot. And of course, that's how you get more home ownership. People, owner occupiers, buy more than investors buy. Do you have a feel for what the next census in 2026 will show? Because first home buying then had a big spike for the rest of 2021 and 22, and it's still kind of elevated. Do you think we might be caught off guard in 2 years that home ownership has actually risen, and we've been writing about a crisis of how hard it is to buy a home for the last 5 years? Because I
Yeah,
suspect that's true. I want to check my reasoning with you.
um, look, I think again, that was a story that wasn't really talked about. The 2021 census was very, very strong in terms of um, housing being more affordable than what it was in the previous census or the census before that, and it wasn't really discussed at all. And it wasn't that surprising to me that things like rent to income had went down, mortgage repayments to income went down, and I think, as you point out, home ownership, it probably ticked up a little tiny bit. Hard to know, I think, where that's going to go in the next
Mm.
census. There's a lot of things going on. COVID's been pretty wild and unpredictable in terms of what's happening. Interest rates obviously have gone up. That will be a negative. But then rents have gone up to some extent, so people are likely to
Yeah.
move more across to home ownership if they can. And Look, I'm really not sure, to be honest, Cameron.
Okay.
I think it probably could
You
be a
wouldn't bet
line
against
ball.
it then?
I wouldn't bet against it. It
Okay.
wouldn't shock me if home ownership was about the same or even slightly better.
Okay.
But I often find, Cam, with statistics, is that the truth is actually much less interesting than what we read about. And usually statistics are actually often quite boring. There's not that much going on. And it wouldn't shock me if the next census actually, after all the craziness of COVID and talk of recession and interest rates going up and rents doing crazy things, apparently, that the next census doesn't look that wildly different, because most people will,
Yeah.
the crisis story is more about at the margins, those at the margins. Most people just keep on keeping on, and
Yeah.
they own their house, they'll keep doing that. They've got a mortgage, they'll keep doing that, and rentals will keep doing what they're doing. I don't think there'll be enormous changes by the next census, but I guess we'll have to wait and see. There's not a lot
Yeah.
of other data that's good hard data. Unfortunately, ABS has been a bit slow at releasing their surveys. But yeah, we'll have to wait and see. But you might be right. I wouldn't be shocked.
Yeah, if anyone's listening and wants to bet against me, I'll take the bet that home ownership will be higher than 66.4%. I think, or was it 66.0, whatever the last number was in the 2021 census. And for me, I think it's remained elevated first home buying since COVID. There's the Victorian land tax where a lot of investors are selling off, and I think, first home buyers will take it up. The rising rents, as you say, and Queensland's just got a new first home buyers grant as well, which is, I think, $30,000 or something. So I think that'll all have a difference. So you also do a lot of general study of the welfare system and subsidies and all the payments that Centrelink makes. And one issue that gets a little bit overlooked is rent assistance. And I think Brendan Coates at Grattan thinks that boosting rent assistance is the best dollar for dollar win in housing, because it goes to mostly low income renters and probably mostly regional renters and lower income households. Would you agree with that, or do you have a different take? Uh, is there something better than that dollar for dollar for
Look, I
helping
think I wouldn't
people?
totally disagree with Brendan on that one. We have a few areas of difference, as you'd well know, around housing supply, but I think in terms of what you can do for housing in the right here and now, I think probably rent assistance is probably a pretty sensible way to go, and the government has, to their credit, increased rent assistance. It's not a lot of money though, so it's not going to make a huge difference. Things like public housing, I think we do need to increase public housing in Australia. But as you'd well know, with supply, these things take a long time. So you could have a big program and it would still take at least 5 or 10 years before you'd make any significant dent in that area. And in terms of the knock-on effects to house prices, also would take a long time. So I think rent assistance is a sensible place to go in the short term. And it has fallen behind rents over the last sort of 20 or so years. There's other areas though where you probably could have even better bang for your buck. And that's things like looking at, say, the job seeker payment, a couple of other working age payments, like, say, disability support payments and parenting payment. Many of these people rent, not all of them, but many of them do rent. And they tend to be the ones who are not just the most likely to be in poverty or financial stress, but the deepest form of, very deep housing stress and very deep poverty and very extreme levels of financial stress. Whereas rent assistance, it also goes to a lot of pensioners who may not be in quite as deeper financial stress as other groups. So look, it's a reasonable policy position to put it into rent assistance. And I think people kind of understand that if you provide money to rent assistance, that goes to people who are low income renters, and that probably largely is right. But technically speaking, there are other areas of welfare where it would probably have even better bang for buck.
Yeah, interesting. So in a way, it's like housing's one part of the sort of income distribution question. It might be big, lumpy and sticky, and it's hard to move, and people rely on their local networks for support. But you're saying equally well, any distribution through the welfare system has a good bang for your buck, dollar for dollar, because it's targeted at the households that get it.
I think an interesting point with rent assistance, like the other payments, is that it really is just an increase in a welfare payment that you can spend on anything. So it goes into what the technicians call the stack of payments. So whether you increase job seeker or you increase rent assistance, it just goes to your fortnightly payment as, say, a job seeker payment.
A different group of people who get it.
That's right, yes.
Group qualifies. So what do
and
you
importantly,
do?
you can spend it on whatever you want. So I think some people get confused and think it goes straight to the landlord. And if that were the case, you might get more inflation. But with this, they can spend it on groceries, they can spend it on petrol, whatever they want. And yes, it might be a little bit inflationary, but probably not as bad as if you were just giving the money directly to the provider, like we do for, say, childcare, where the subsidy goes direct to the provider and they feel like they can increase their prices very strongly because it's just coming to a greater subsidy.
Wow. Okay. Two things I want to pick up there. Firstly, rent assistance requires you typically to be on another welfare payment, right? To then qualify an additional rent assistance. So for all those renters who aren't on any welfare payment, whose rents have gone up $200, do we just go, well, you're in the market. You're in the middle of the income distribution for your family's household structure. Bad luck. We expect market outcomes and you to deal with them. So that's probably the first question. And the second one, that you mentioned. Oh, what did you mention right at the end? Oh, it'll come back to me. Subsidizing childcare. Do you think it's better to subsidize the families per child, like the Polish cash payment per child, and let families choose whether to spend that on childcare or other goods? So let's kind of wrap up with these two more detailed questions.
Yeah, the childcare ones, it's a difficult one, I think. Because obviously if your kids are in childcare, that's a very, very large expense. And if you're trying to design, say, a child payment system that was covering everybody, because basically, look, you only use childcare if you've got young kids, obviously. And then even then, probably 40% of households, they don't use formal childcare. So they're either using grandparents or they're a stay-at-home parent. And obviously for a stay-at-home parent, your costs in terms of childcare are very, very small. So the Australian approach is basically to target these things. So if you are using childcare, you'll get a subsidy. Or you don't get the subsidy yourself, but it goes to the childcare provider. I'm not convinced that's really working very well in Australia. I think it's leading to a lot of inflation in childcare prices. So perhaps a better approach would be direct payments to childcare providers for providing a certain service. That will probably also have its own issues, but hopefully that would deal with the inflation issue that we have with childcare, that every time you increase subsidies, the childcare prices also go up
Mm,
as well. I do think,
that's a
generally speaking, we probably are not as generous as we should be with welfare. There's a lot of people, as you point out, with rent assistance who would still miss out because a lot of
yeah,
people are not on a welfare payment. And that's because they might have a little bit too much in assets. Their liquid
yeah.
assets might be too high to get the payment. They might have come from another country and there's like a 4 or 5 year waiting period to get a payment. They might just not want to deal with having to look for 5 or 6 jobs every month or so. So there's lots of reasons why people
Yeah.
would miss out, and I think we're probably a little bit too stingy. We have a little bit too much of a concern with dole bludgers with regard to welfare, and that means that a lot of people miss out who probably are in pretty serious financial trouble. And if that was a more generous system,
Yeah.
you'd get around that problem. But obviously, this costs money. You'd have to increase taxes or find savings elsewhere to make that happen.
Yeah. So it sounds like in the childcare, it's a classic economic incentive effect of, the household and the childcare basically bargain and set the price, but someone else pays. Whereas if you just paid lump sum to the childcare, they would bargain like what they bargained wouldn't affect the subsidy, if you
Yeah.
know what I mean. So,
And ultimately, who pays is the taxpayer. So I think something that would be surprising to many is that childcare costs today are about the same as what they were in terms of your out-of-pocket costs, so what you actually pay as a parent, in nominal terms from about 6 years ago. So there's been no increase in
right.
fees that you pay. But of course, the childcare centres have increased their fees by sort of 5, 6, 7% every year. In terms of gross prices, you'd be lucky to find an area with more inflation. I think it's been as inflationary as house prices over the last sort of 20 years.
Yeah.
Probably as inflationary as even say something like gas, which has increased very sharply. But most of the cost has been borne by the taxpayer. And unfortunately, the way we've set it up, that's only going to continue because there's no real incentive. There's no real reason for childcare providers to lower their prices or to be all
Yeah.
that competitive when the subsidy is there to cover whatever costs you want to charge.
And am I right that the subsidy is based on the incomes of the parent as well? So there's a group of people wealthy two-income families who don't get any subsidy. So they see the prices rise, whereas further down the distribution, the prices are not rising at all. Is
Yeah,
that
so
true?
it is dependent on your income, but it
Hmm.
has changed a lot in the last couple of years. So the most
Right.
recent change, there was some reforms in 2018, which expanded the subsidy to a wider range of incomes, out to about 350,000 a year,
Oh,
which is
wow.
that's most families are comfortably within that
Yeah.
limit. And now it's been expanded to 530,000, and that's really about the top. That's about 99% of
Yeah.
households in the childcare space would qualify. But obviously, if you're on 500,000 a year, your subsidy rate is very, very small. But look, most of the median household would be getting a subsidy at the moment of about 80%.
Yeah. No,
Um,
that's
and even if you're on, say, quite a high income of 200,000 a year, you're probably on a subsidy of sort of 65, 70%. So childcare
wow.
centres know this. They know they can increase their price and you're still going to be getting a very large subsidy. So most of the increase will be covered by the government. And that's why childcare subsidies for government have increased enormously in the last 10 or so years.
This is a classic economic problem of incentive design and subsidizing the wrong thing. And I remember there was a rent subsidy, which was a fixed amount, 11,000 per landlord for giving 20% below market, right? I don't know, what was that called? The National Rental Affordability Scheme was a fixed amount.
NRAS, National
And
Rental Affordability Scheme, yeah.
so what happened is, well, if you're in a low rental area, 20% discount on your rent is way less than the 11,000 fixed price that you'll get as a subsidy. So you essentially overpaid and only got discounted rents in low income areas. So you paid like $2 for every discount
Yeah.
to the tenant of $1. So that's another classic economic design problem. Sounds like we can fix it in childcare. It does make me, some people have suggested childcare should just be at public schools, and if just make it free, and if you want it you do it, if you don't you don't. Do you think that's another alternative?
Um, Look, I have a bit of a different take on that. I don't think that childcare is complicated. Like if they're sort of 4 or 5 years old, the children, I kind of get that, and I think
Mm,
there's some, there's nice returns to having kids in good childcare if they're older. But what about if they're 6 months old?
yeah,
There's there's it sort of becomes more like school the older the kids get. But obviously, school is compulsory. Childcare is not compulsory, so that it should be free, or there should be a free option if the, if the kids have to go to
compulsory.
school. But they don't
Yeah,
have to They don't have to go to daycare when they're 6 months old. And there's no real gains, I don't
yeah,
think. We often talk about the returns from early education, and that's true, but it's usually for older kids and probably only for a certain number of hours a week. It's
yeah,
probably not 5 days a week. It's probably more like 2 or 3 days a week where they get some gains. 5 days a week for young children, say 1, 2, or zero,
yeah,
1 or 2. I think the gains are very, very small there, and really the main gains are that the parents get to go to work.
yeah.
The children are just being looked after. Really, they're not getting any
That's
particular
right.
educational benefits when they're really, really small.
So, are
So
you a
it's
fan?
complicated.
Are you so in general, as a sort of final point, are you a fan of cash payments, like less targeting of cash payments? So there's always a UBI discussion, and I'm like, well, yeah, you just pay per child a fixed amount, and if you have a child, you get a fixed amount. If you don't, you don't. Um, do you think is that oversimplifying it, or do you think there's some merit to going that direction in many of the payments
Yeah,
that
so
we have?
Australia tends to have obviously has a very targeted welfare system. Um, I tend to think a targeting of the system is reasonably effective, but I think we're too targeted, we're too tight. I
Mm,
think we should be more generous and more people should receive it. Um, and there's too many hoops to go through to get some of these payments, particularly say a job seeker payment, and it's too difficult to get onto payments like say disability support. So I believe more in loosening up the current system. I'm not really a big fan of the universal basic income in its full broad scale, where say everybody gets a payment of say the age pension. I think the cost of that is dramatically. The current system, we spend about 150 billion a year on cash payments. If you went to a full UBI, you're looking at $600 billion.
yeah,
And I think you start to need to have tax rates that if you did that through personal income tax, the tax rates are extraordinary. They're off the charts. They'd be 60, 70, 80, 90%. You could do
but
it
aren't
through
they
other
already
forms.
that effectively with welfare phase outs for many groups?
No, I don't think. I think for some they are, small groups they are, but mostly they're not. You'll generally find that the biggest form of, the biggest tax in Australia is personal income tax.
Mm,
Looking at other forms of effective marginal tax rates is probably allowances, a bit of childcare and
yeah,
pensions and family payments. And because they're so tightly targeted, they're actually not adding that much to effective marginal tax rates overall. Some, but not dramatically.
oh,
I think you'd have
just because so few people are on them that
That's
across
right.
the
Yes.
market. Got it. Got it.
Yeah. So I'm not saying it's a good thing, but we have this very tightly targeted welfare system. So fewer actually on it. Like
Mm,
there's very few people who are on job seeker and are
yeah.
also working as well. It's a very small number. Most people that once they start working, they're just off the payment and it's no longer an issue for them.
The effect on overall effective marginal tax rates is not high because the groups that are affected are so small by those high phase outs. Is that your general point
That's
about
right.
the?
Yeah. So if like in Australia at the moment, if you start working and you're on job seeker, you do lose 60 cents in the dollar or 50 or 60 cents in the dollar, depending on your income. That's a big effective marginal tax rate. Sounds big, but almost no one's impacted by it because most of them are not working. And there's a small number who do, but most people who go and get a job, be that 3 days a week or full time, will just go off that payment and
Yeah,
then
I
their
see.
EMTR goes back to being like, they might be on the 9 or 21 cents in the dollar marginal tax rate. Um, it's a bit
Yeah,
more of an issue with, say, family payments, which is probably over a pretty long range of incomes where you're losing that payment.
yeah,
But it's still by and large the main factor of effective marginal tax rates in Australia is personal income tax. If you go to a UBI, depends how you fund it, of course, but a full-blown UBI requires enormous funding. And if that was
mm,
through much larger personal income tax, we'd all be on much higher EMTRs.
yeah, right.
There's
So
some
you're
good things
saying
about
instead of
UBI.
a few people with very high, you'd have everybody with kind of high.
That's right. Yeah. So
Mm,
most people might be on a 30 cent tax rate at the moment. If we went to a UBI, unless we found some new source of tax, like we had some massive land tax, or I don't know, some amazing mining tax, or something.
Hmm.
Likely, I mean, the big form of tax in Australia has always been personal income tax, and probably will always stay as that.
Mm.
So it would have to do a lot of the work, I think. And instead of having, say, an average tax rate of, say, 20% relative to house 25%, it might have to be, double that if you had a full-blown UBI, which I just can't see it happening. I know there's people who are very much fans of UBI. I don't see it happening, and I think it's difficult to implement. And I
Yeah.
could see it being the need for higher taxes would be extraordinary. I mean, we tried to increase in a carbon price a few years ago. I know it's a bit of a loaded term, a carbon price. That was
Mm.
$5 billion a year of revenue, and that got knocked on the head. We worry about
Yeah.
bracket creep every single year. How you'd go and potentially, need to double the amount of tax the government receives to fund this. I don't see it happening. Having said that, there's other things we could do, I think, to make a more generous welfare system, like increase the job seeker payment, not be so punitive with our approach. You shouldn't need to have to look for so many jobs, particularly if you're living in regions
Yeah.
where there's no jobs anyway, or have long waiting periods for people who come from other countries. And there's issues that could improve the situation dramatically, that probably don't cost that much money, maybe, 5, 10, 15 billion a year, whereas UBI, I mean, hundreds of billions of dollars per year. I can't
Yeah.
see it happening.
Yeah. That's a good point. What do you think of the Kiwi pension system there, which is essentially a UBI for old people with no means testing? And I think the interesting part there is that they have something like 5% participation of over 65s in the workforce, and we have something like 14 or 15%.
Yep.
Do you think that's predominantly that effect, or some portion of that, or is it that important or interesting to you?
Yeah, look,
Those,
it's probably not as interesting to me. And I say that just because when I look at financial stress rates, I see that older Australians are by and large doing very, very well.
mm,
Um, and I, I kind of agree with you, Cam. I think I've seen you mention many times that we talk too much about an aging population, and that we overplay the extent that that's an issue. I kind of agree with that. Having said that, somewhere like New Zealand probably will have an aging population. We don't really have an aging population compared to other countries. They're pretty young, which I think gets
yeah,
forgotten. If you go to many European countries, their median age is like 5, 10 years older than us, which is a big
yeah,
difference. But look, it's still going to be something of an issue where you're going to need to find more revenue down the track, which we never like doing to fund that. And I would rather see money spent elsewhere, like say on working age welfare recipients is where I'd go first. Just because I'm being very pragmatic, Cam, that I know how hard it is to increase welfare payments in Australia, and I know how
yeah,
hard it is to increase taxes. So I would fight the battle down the
yeah.
lower end of the scale before I went to the pensioners, who I think are doing kind of okay.
I'm just putting my fingers up so I remember to respond to two things that you said. Um, let's start at the last one, which was targeting at the families. And I've noticed, so my kids are in high school, and I have noticed that, my goodness, your spending requirements are so high. And I just keep thinking, we're not looking forward to the kids moving out, but at the same time, we're thinking, how easy is it going to be to make money when we don't have kids and their activities and the time? And right, like, we should make money in our 50s when our kids are out of home, because it's just two of us, two, high income couple. It's much harder now. So I get that it's that composition of household. It's, I can't imagine people with less income and four kids trying to make it in a big city in Australia. That's got to be really tough. So that's my first response to what you said. I've sort of lived through it and seen that it's actually when you have kids that you need money, right? Because there's more people. But that the other point you said was, old people are doing quite well financially. And I do find this funny, right? We have this public debate where old people are all in poverty and we've got to boost the pension. At the same time, old people have all the houses and all the money and they're so rich, we've got to take all the money off them. Like, which is it, right? Are they the super wealthy? They own all the houses. They're super rich. We've got to tax them more, or are they all poor? I mean, there's a lot of pensioners with a lot of money that I think if you were a family with a couple of kids in your 20s and you were sitting there going, oh, you own your own home, you've got no kids, and you've got a few hundred thousand in the bank, and my taxes are paying for you, I think you'd be rightly a little bit upset. Like, no, now is the time to socialize and share with me, not with you.
Yeah, I think
Does that make sense, that complaint? Or do you think maybe that's even overblown?
no, I think you're probably spot on there, Cam. I think
Oh,
we've got the balance wrong in Australia. I think we are too generous towards our older Australians. They pay virtually no tax on their superannuation. Um, I think the financial stress rates for older Australians are very low, whereas people of say in their 30s and 40s and 50s who are raising children, their financial stress rates are much higher. I think they're probably paying too much in superannuation throughout their career. I think this getting to 12% or even going to 15% is too much. I don't think it needs to be that high. We've already got a whole cohort of Australians who weren't in this big superannuation period who are doing reasonably well. Why do we need to balance things even more so towards older Australians with effectively taxing you more with your high superannuation today, so you've got more money when you're older and you don't need it as much? And we're
yeah,
not generous enough with, say, family payments and other parts of the system for younger Australians who are, they're trying to get into the housing market. They're trying to pay for kids. We know kids are very expensive, particularly older kids.
yeah,
We're so tight with our welfare system for that period of your life where it's difficult to work all the hours that you would want to work because you've got children. You've got enormous financial pressures compared to older part of life. We've got the balance wrong. Potentially some of it's political in that we're increasingly got an older age group who vote, and
mm,
politicians are wanting to support those. But I think the greatest pressure points really is when you're a young family with with kids, whether they're in sort of primary school or high school, you've got two or three kids or more, and I think that's where it's challenging. So we have too much emphasis on end of life where we already know you're doing fine, even people with
yeah,
relatively small super balances. Um, you know, there should be more
yeah.
support for younger people, not so much older people. We've got the equation wrong, I think.
Isn't it funny? We might sort of leave it there and just reflect that again, it sounds like one of those big picture things where the state of the media debate is the opposite of what the data says. That in the media, we hear all the old people are in poverty and we need to boost the pension, whereas in the reality is the financial stress is concentrated in families. And then we've got the housing stress more in the regions rather than the expensive suburbs. This is why I tell people follow Ben on Twitter for straight facts, because you just need a dose of that every now and then in the media. Let's wrap up. Is there anything else you want to share with the audience? Where can people find you, Ben?
So look, I'm on Twitter. So
Yeah,
I'm actually not even sure what my handle is, Cam. Now you put me on the
I'll
spot,
put it
but I
in the
think if
show
you were
notes
to,
then.
I think if it's probably Ben Phillips _ ANU, I think is probably what it is. So that's probably an easy place to follow the things that I have to say.
Mm,
Don't have to agree with me, but hopefully I've got some useful insights for you. Same thing with Cam. I very much enjoy following Cam's work.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, look,
thanks,
absolutely get
mate.
involved in the conversation in Twitter. That's probably the main place to find me. If
Yeah,
you really want to have a deeper conversation, give me a call or email me here at ANU, and I think you can Google my details.
yeah, great. No, I always when you put out a chart with this survey, I'm just like, there's some facts finally for this debate. So I always share it, Ben. Thanks very much for your time. We'll have to do this again.
Thanks, Cam. Been my pleasure, and all the best to you and your followers.
Thank you.